We're now joined by Colonel James Sunderland, who's a Conservative MP and former army officer. James, when it comes to the West and Europe on this issue, it seems we're pretty divided because certain nations have called out, as we have done, the ICC on going after Netanyahu for what's going on over in Gaza. Countries like the Czech Republic have turned around and said, you know, not on your Nelly, we don't recognise this. How important is it that this government is seen to be defending Israel at the same time as other governments, Norway, Ireland and Spain, seem to be increasingly taking the side of a Palestinian state?
It's interesting because I think when the atrocities happened in October last year, most Western countries, in fact, most Arab countries actually were quite aligned in terms of the horror at what happened on that fateful day. And I think that in terms of foreign policy, there was that sense of consensus with how those Western countries went forward. What's happening, of course, now is that because of the images being beamed into our living rooms, because of what's happening in Gaza, in terms of the way in which Israel is prosecuting that campaign, people are becoming flaky, and people quite rightly are concerned about the loss of life in Gaza. But my sense is that actually most countries in the West remain aligned in terms of Israel's right to self-defense and Israel's right to defend itself as a sovereign nation.
The Labour Party have turned around and basically welcomed what the ICC have said and sort of rattled out that age-old favourite phrase of politicians, which is, well, you know, everyone's got to obey international law. The point is, of course, that Israel aren't signatories to the ICC, but we are. So if Labour come into government and they say, well, look, this has to be upheld, what does that mean for our foreign affairs? Does that mean that essentially, if it was a Labour government and Netanyahu deigns to set foot upon British soil, that we'd have to arrest him?
It's a fair one. I think Labour's all at sea with most of its foreign policy, actually. But there is a dividing line now between Labour and the Conservatives. Clearly, the Conservative Party are continuing that very consistent message that we need to support Israel's right to self-defence, but also hold Israel to account as a critical friend. My concern with the ICC potential arrest warrants, of course, is that the timing and the scope of those warrants implies some kind of moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, which, of course, is not the case. So I think the Prime Minister was right to call it out. I think the Prime Minister today at PMQs will probably expose Labour's weakness on this. And quite clearly, we must not and we must never yield to a terrorist organisation in the Middle East.
Yeah, I want to bring in Philip Ingram, who joins me today. Philip, we were talking, weren't we, before we actually came on air, about some of these statistics. And these are the things that are being bandied about by protesters, by mainstream media as well. We know that the alleged death toll that Hamas had put out of women and children has had to be revised down by the UN to a degree of around 50%. One thing that people look at, and one thing, of course, that someone like the ICC should be looking at when it comes to whether or not Israel is indeed committing war crimes or genocide, as pro-Palestine protesters like to suggest, is essentially the ratio of how many civilians are dying in relation to how many militants have been part of the number of fatalities. Why is that important?
Well, it's important from a public perspective because it's an indication as to how much control there is from the state in making sure that they're looking after the civilians, which is a requirement under international law. But when it comes to targeting, and international law, it isn't an exact law. It's open to so many different interpretations. When it comes to military targeting, there are two things you look at: the necessity of the target and the proportionality of what you're going to do to have the effect on the target. The necessity, is it a legitimate military target? Yes or no? That doesn't mean, you know, are there lots of civilians around it and all the rest of it. If it's a legitimate military target, then it can be prosecuted under international law, no matter what else is, because the proportionality is the other bit, and that is subjective, and that is up to the decision of the politicians as to what level they'd accept of collateral damage. In the UK, it tends to be as close to zero as is possible, but in Israel and elsewhere, then they politically they will accept much more collateral damage. provided they're prosecuting a legitimate military target, then that collateral damage, if it's acceptable politically, is something that doesn't automatically mean that they're breaking international law. So this is where there's a real difficulty. Israel hasn't helped itself in that where it's targeted individuals in aid convoys, and we've seen Israeli soldiers shooting their own hostages as they're trying to surrender and everything else. And those pictures coming out, that's been taken by Hamas and others and turned into their very, very successful information operation that is being used to feed everything into the West. And that's what's caused this political move by Norway, Ireland and Spain. That's what's causing a lot of the protests out around. And Hamas know that they can't beat Israel militarily, so they're beating them in the information sphere.
Right, and isn't that what it's all about, James, essentially? And Hamas are actually playing quite a sophisticated game. They know full well when they're putting tunnels and launching missiles from hospitals and schools that they are using people as human shields. There have been allegations that Hamas themselves are sort of trying to encourage civilians to walk into lines of fire. And of course, let's not forget the sort of what looks like a degree of infiltration of Hamas into some of these aid vehicles and, you know, UNRWA, for example, the UN element operating over there. And if we don't turn around and call this out as the West and look at what the ICC are doing and sort of implicate both Hamas and Israel to the same extent, that we are essentially just doing things according to what is Hamas's playbook.
Well, I think you're right. I think Phil's right as well. There is no moral equivalence at all between Hamas and Israel at the moment. And I'm not sure what Hamas's plan was before the 7th of October, but it appears to be evolving, I imagine, more or less as they envisaged it. So by committing an appalling terrorist atrocity, resulting in the deaths of 1,000 or more Israeli citizens, innocent people, you've then got a situation where West is split in terms of its public opinion. You've got Iranian support ongoing. Hamas continues to show a complete lack of respect for civilians in Gaza themselves in terms of taking the food, in terms of human shields, in terms of no respect at all for their own people, you could argue. So in many ways, Israel is right to continue with that campaign. Israel's made it quite clear that it cannot continue to exist with a terrorist organization next door that wants to wipe it off the face of the earth. Will the ICC arrest warrants? Will they have an effect on Netanyahu? Probably not. Noting, of course, as you mentioned earlier, that Israel's not signed or a member of the ICC. So my suspicion is that the warrants themselves will have no major impact on the evolution of the battle.
And James, finally, Grant Shapps has turned around and said, like many people before him, that NATO members need to be spending a lot more when it comes to defence. We live in a pretty dangerous world today. He's going to be making a bullish speech at the London Defence Conference and talking to countries such as Ireland and Australia. At the moment, only Poland, the United States, Lithuania and Estonia spend more than 2.5%. You've got other parts of the world saying that actually 2.5% itself is nowhere near enough. I mean, why is this so critical? Why is it? I mean, Donald Trump before has sort of turned around and said to some of these NATO members, I mean, you've got to take everything Donald Trump says with a pinch of salt. But, you've got what's coming to you if Putin decides to cross the border into your nations. If you're not spending what you need to spend when it comes to protecting yourself and protecting this alliance, and not just expecting America to row in at the 11th hour and protect the lot of you.
Alex, there's a lot in there. And again, you're right. I mean, let's face the facts. Russia has invaded a sovereign neighbour in terms of Ukraine. Russia is showing no signs at all of giving up. Russia is a danger. It's a menace. It's no coincidence, of course, that we've got two new countries joining NATO, Finland and Sweden. So do we need to be spending more on defence? Absolutely, yes. Is Grant Shapps right? 110%. We need to be spending not just 2% as NATO members, but 2.5 and beyond. We need to spend what it needs to do the job. So in my humble view, NATO must be resolute. NATO must be better funded than it actually is. Europe must be able to stand on its own 2 feet without excessive or significant US support. Europe has to be able to defend itself better. And in my view, 18 countries currently in NATO providing 2% commitment. It needs to be everyone, and it needs to be above 2.5%.
James, thank you very much. That's Colonel James Sunderland there, Conservative MP and former Army officer. Now